This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. K-State Extension agronomists Logan Simon and Tina Sullivan start the show as they explain a formula that corn growers can use to estimate corn yields in their fields. Cassandra Olds, K-State livestock entomologist, moves the show forward as she discusses horseflies and deer flies. She says how to tell them apart and how they get their meals. Ending the show is K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk talking about research that shows keeping late-gestation cows cool and comfortable helps to minimize the effect the environment might have on their unborn calf. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show discussing the corn crop and yield estimates with two K-State Extension agronomists, Logan Simon and Tina Sullivan. Logan, Tina, I appreciate you both taking the time to join us today.
We're happy to be on.
How is this year's corn crop looking?
When we consider everything that this corn crop has gone through this year, we are sitting pretty good if we're looking at the statewide average right now. The USDA report that came out late July 27th, we are sitting about 42% of the corn crop looking good, only 12% looking excellent, and you can kind of do the math where the rest of the crop is sitting at. And it has been hit kind of hard by a lot of those weather events we had, whether it was hail or wind events, whether it was rain, washing out some of our fields, causing replants or just delays in planting in some other areas. Just overall, we kind of had that slower start, maybe that restart in some of those fields. But when we think about going towards our reproductive phases of corn, so really trying to get that grain yield, the state is sitting currently at 70% is silking, 34% is in dough phase. Central, South Central, and Southeast Kansas are the ones leading the pack in silking, and they're pretty far ahead into that dough and heading towards finishing, where areas that traditionally are going to be a bit further behind, like Northwest Kansas, are sitting at 21% silking. When it comes to our silking, our grain fill stages, weather does affect it, right? If we are not getting proper moisture or it's still really hot at night like it has been, it can affect how well the corn is pollinating and how well those pollen grains hit the silks. And if kind of a telltale sign of a silk not getting its pollen, it's going to grow really long because it was trying to use as much energy as it could searching for those pollen sacs.
Is now the time then for growers to start going out into the crop field and maybe making some yield estimates?
Exactly. For the crop so far that has gotten past that silking and tassel phase, now is the time when we are able to go out there and get a general estimate as of right now, how well everything has pollinated. And then from there, as we move forward, how well those grains have, those individual kernels are filling out. As we do know, in these periods of stress, we can also, even with good pollination, we can see some tipping back as we get the abortion of some of those kernels towards the tip of the ear in response to stresses, be drought or heat or other resource limitation. So really, any time past that silking and tassel phase, we can start getting at least an estimate of what our yield potential is right now.
What is the calculation, or how are you making that estimate?
Absolutely. So when we are going out and looking to do a yield estimate for corn, we are going to be looking at the variety of components that make up the final yield in that corn crop. The first step is going to be going out there and just getting an idea for plants per acre, and then from there, ears per acre. With 30-inch rows, we say that we know that 17.4 feet of row is 1/1000th of an acre. So what that means is that when we are going out and we're counting plants or ears in 17.4 feet a row, we can multiply that by 1,000 to then determine our ears or plants per acre. Once we have calculated our ears per acre, we then need to start looking at kernels per ear. When we're looking at kernels per ear, we're going to be counting the rows of kernels along the length of that ear, and we're also going to be counting the number of kernels around the circumference of that ear. So it may require taking that ear and breaking it apart so that you can get an idea of that total number of kernels around there in the middle of that ear. It's important to remember that kernels are going to be produced in sets of 2, and so the number of kernels around that ear will always be an even number. But the number of kernels per row along the length of that ear may differ. Probably one of our biggest sources of error in this overall calculation of corn yield is going to be thinking about the kernels per bushel, which is your kind of getting at your test weight as we're calculating up to that final bushels per acre. When we're thinking about bushels per acre, or kernels per bushel rather, we need to be thinking about how well filled and developed and heavy those kernels are likely to be. Remember that poor kernel development is going to mean more kernels per bushel. A bushel is a unit of volume, where if we have really good fill, then those kernels are going to, it takes fewer kernels to fill that volume of a bushel. If we are looking at an excellent crop, we're probably going to make our estimate somewhere between 75 and 80,000 kernels per bushel. Average is going to be more 85 to 90, and then poor is somewhere between 95 and 105,000 kernels per bushel. This is probably our biggest source of error, as sometimes if we don't have a good frame of reference of what this should be, we can sometimes overestimate what this value might be, especially say on like a dryland acre where kernels per bushel may be a little bit less consistent year to year compared to an irrigated acre or really strong if you were in an area of the state that is more consistent in rainfall versus the highly volatile dryland acres of central and western Kansas. In the end, you are going to multiply all of these factors together and ultimately land with your final estimate of bushels per acre. However, it is so important that people understand that at any point during the season, we are simply getting an estimate, and your final is potentially going to differ. Again, that test weight factor, kernels per bushel, is probably our biggest source of error. So keep that in mind and how that possibly overly optimistic estimate may influence your decision making as we approach the end of the season.
Why would you maybe encourage a grower to go out and do an estimate in their field?
A number of reasons why producers may go out and do some estimations. I think the biggest thing for a producer, depending on their stage, if we're just past tassel and we're still in a place when it comes to the growth and development of that crop, where we may still be making some decisions around fungicide applications for, say, southern rust or things like that. This can give us an idea of just how much yield we're looking to protect with that fungicide application and how well that pays based on how well we pollinated. As we get later in the season towards maturity, the big question there becomes how much space do I need to have in order to store all of that yield that I'll have coming in. This is going to be important for all of our grain handlers, folks that have on-farm storage of their own, possibly needing to plan ahead if we have limited on-farm storage, potentially needing to make some decisions around, do I need to consider bagging this year because of the volume of grain we may be bringing in this year? All of these are reasons why it is always a good idea for a producer to go out and get an estimate of what kind of yield are we talking about, as that gives us a much better ability to plan ahead for what all we may be dealing with once the combines start rolling.
Are there other big points that growers should consider?
I think the biggest thing that will likely influence a lot of us is the heat that we've had. Anything that pollinated during that time frame is going to be potentially severely hit as this heat extended over the course of several days. Anything that pollinated before or is going to pollinate after, this is the value of varying our planting dates and varying our maturities so that we have pollination across the farm happening over the course of a longer window as opposed to putting all your eggs in one basket and running the risk of having that tasseling and pollination occur in that Kansas heat that we always know will come sometime here in the summer. So keep an eye out on those fields, especially if we were pollinating during that time. Now is the time to determine just how well we did coming out of that heat. I know that we've got some later planted stuff that has not even yet hit tassel. And so it'll be very interesting to see as we move that crop forward what that will look like, as we'll be hopefully seeing that crop tassel during a much cooler time, getting over this peak heat, as is the idea of that kind of later corn crop here in the state.
Logan, Tina, I appreciate both taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having us, Shelby.
Those were two K-State Extension agronomists, Logan Simon and Tina Sullivan. If you'd like to read more on this topic, I will link an Agronomy e-update article titled Estimating Corn Yield Potential Using the Yield Component Method in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing horseflies with K-State livestock entomologist Cassandra Olds. Cassandra, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, very happy to be here.
Cassandra, can you tell us a little bit about the biology and life cycle of a horsefly?
Yeah, so people use the word horsefly what we really mean is tabanids. So tabanids is the umbrella, and that includes horseflies and deer flies. And they're very, very similar. And most people aren't going to notice too much of a difference. Both of them tend to have very colorful eyes, have very painful bites. But if you look super closely, a horsefly has a clear wing and a deer fly has kind of a banded dark pattern across it. And so, fun fact, you could tell whether it's a horsefly or a deer fly from the wings. There's also some things about the head that are different, but I don't think anybody's going to get close enough to the head to use that as a decision making. But they're these two groups of flies, and within this, there's many species, right? So we talk about them as a group, but there's actually a whole lot of species in there, and this is why it's so difficult to control them, because each species has a slightly different preference for where it's going to lay its eggs. Some are fully aquatic, so they'll lay their eggs in the water and the little larvae are in the water. And fun fact, I once found a larva in a horse water trough, and I went to the pet store to try and get a net to fish it out. And by the time I came back, I just could not find it. So, they're very, very tricky. Some of them like sort of muddy substrates, so semi-aquatic. And then there's others that are fully terrestrial. So that's why you can have a real high variation year from year because, depending on what rain you've had, what your humidity is like, you could select for one species over another species.
You mentioned painful bites. Are there any other health concerns they bring to livestock?
Yeah, so we want to, they're not great because they've got really big mouth parts. Anybody who's squashed one, and by the way, they're really hard to squash, like especially those big black ones, you can whack them and they're like, okay, I'm cool. So they're very robust, but they've got very big mouth parts. And so what happens is because they've got these really big mouth parts, when they take a blood meal, it's very painful. And so they've also got to probe multiple times. There's a really interesting, fascinating / gross video on YouTube. If you Google tabanid feeding, there's a guy who lets some tabanids feed on him, and you can actually watch this tabanid probe, and then it's not quite right, and then probe again, and then it's not quite right, and blood pools out from it. And so they cut up the tissues, and then they form this pool of blood, and then they suck it up. But because it's so painful, most people aren't like, hey, yeah, tabanid, you can eat on me, it's fine. They will actually dislodge the fly, right? So for livestock, we usually see fly worry, right? They'll dislodge it with their head, or they'll flick their tail, or they'll try and walk under trees or stand in water, things like that. So then what happens is, because of the mouth parts being contaminated with blood, they then go and they will feed on another animal, for example. And so what you have is you have the movement of the pathogen that's in the blood from one individual to another individual. And so when we think of this, when we think about things like anaplasmosis, theileriosis, even equine infectious anemia virus, and really equine infectious anemia virus is the big one, right? So people aren't always aware, but when you move your horse across state lines, or honestly, when you move it anywhere new, you need to have a Coggins test, which takes antibodies to equine infectious anemia virus. And a lot of times I've been at places and a new horse has come in and maybe they haven't got the Coggins result with them. So they're like, oh, it's fine because the vet's coming. But we kept it separate from the other horses. It can't touch the other horses. And that really means nothing if you've got flies flying about. And so we don't always think about these things in terms of how they move from animal to animal.
I know I've squished a few of them, but are there other ways for controlling them?
So the problem is that they're really hard to control because so the breeding sites, normally when we talk about controlling any pest arthropod, we say most important thing is remove the breeding site. Well, if I have if I remove the aquatic breeding site, so maybe there's a stagnant pond and I get rid of that, but maybe now it's mud and so a different species can move in, or it's gone dry. So it's really difficult to remove breeding sites. They do not really spend long enough on the host. And by the way, it's only the females who blood feed. So using an insecticide doesn't generally work. They're normally quite big. And so the bigger an insect gets, the more insecticide you need to kill it. And so we don't have enough on the animal. So that's not always worth it. And they really don't, you can put up traps, but these are huge, 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 huge traps. And maybe it attracts some species, maybe it doesn't attract others. So really the only thing you can do, cattle, almost nothing, right? For horses, we can do a few more things, a full head to tail, fly sheet is usually the only way to stop the bites, leg coverings and stuff like that. In terms of sort of humans and our companion animals, wearing long sleeves and pants and, avoiding having skin is showing out and open. I was walking my dog this week at Rocky Ford, and a tabanid, it was a little deer fly, landed in between his eyes and tried to feed on his nose. And I had to squash it. And there I could squash it because I snuck up on it and I squashed it. But, if it's a smaller species, you can try and whack it. The bigger ones, sometimes you whack them and it's not quite enough to kill them. And so you just have to, try and avoid them as much as possible. They're honestly one of the most difficult things to control. The other things that people have tried out that horse owners do say works, you can get, so one of the natural predators of a tabanid is a dragonfly. And so you can clip a little fake dragonfly like on the horse's bridle and it just kind of scares off the tabanid. I haven't done any trials to see how well it works, but anecdotally people swear by it. But then you talk about other people who have gone fishing, for example, and clip it onto their little peacock and say it doesn't do anything. So I don't know. The jury's out.
Do these horsefly, deer flies, tabanids have certain livestock they prefer to get their meal from?
I think that, they're not terribly fussy. There are a few, like the big black ones. We usually find those on cattle. But honestly, they're not that fussy that if a deer walks past, they're not going to try and take a meal from the deer. When I'm out at Rocky Ford, they're trying to bite me. They're trying to bite the dog. They're probably trying to bite the dog more than they're trying to bite me. But, is that just because I'm, dislodging them before they get a chance? It's tricky. But they're not super host specific.
Any comparisons that they really have to our smaller flies?
In a biological sense, right? A pair of wings and having an egg stage and a larval stage and a pupal stage and then an adult stage and then, that one blood feeds. But yeah, they're closely related. They're in the same group as mosquitoes and houseflies and stable flies and horn flies, but they're just a different branch of the family.
When can we be hoping that they'll be leaving or no longer making appearances?
I think if this humidity keeps up, we, at least in eastern Kansas, are going to see them until the fall, until things really cool down significantly.
Cassandra, any fun facts when it comes to these?
One fun fact. So they have these really beautiful, colorful eyes, but the eyes lose color after they die.
What color are the eyes most likely going to be?
They're beautiful. They like have these banding patterns, and they're depending on the species, but they can be oranges and yellows and greens, and it's just beautiful, beautiful eyes. But then you kill them, and you're like, oh, look at this beautiful eye, and you kill them, and then they lose their color. The other thing that you can see is if you watch them really closely, they'll sort of walk in their front pair of legs. They'll kind of like tap on the surface to see if that's what they should try and eat.
How interesting.
They're fascinating. They're terrible, but they're fascinating. Two things can be true at the same time, I always say.
I agree, Cassandra. Thanks for taking the time to join us today.
You're welcome.
That was K-State livestock entomologist Cassandra Olds. Before we cut to a break, we're now going to be joined by U.S. Department of Agriculture's Rod Bain and National Agricultural Statistics Services Lance Honig as they discuss what USDA's latest edition of its Land Values Report reflects regarding values of agricultural properties.
The summary from USDA's annual look at ag land values and cash rents. Lance Honig of the National Agricultural Statistics Service says from the report issued Friday regarding land values,
the sixth consecutive year of increasing values across the board, but maybe a bit of a slowing in terms of that increase. We saw a little bit of a slowdown in those increases last year, a little bit. We're talking about three major categories: all land and buildings, cropland, and pasture, and again, increases across the board on all three categories, a little bit slower than what we've seen in some of the recent years.
Meanwhile, the average cash rate producers paid for rental land for their ag operations this year was similar to the year before, steady to slightly lower in categories, with pasture land rental rates up $1 from the prior year. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because when we come back from our break, we'll be joined by K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk.
Welcome back, and thanks for joining us on Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. Research shows that keeping late gestation cows cool and comfortable helps to minimize the effect the environment might have on their unborn calf. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk says that heifers born to heat-stressed dams produce less milk in their first lactation, about 2,000 pounds less than those born to dams that were not heat-stressed. Mike says that supplemental fans and soaker systems are the most effective tools for keeping cows cool.
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning some issues we have with heat stress as it relates to dry cows and the calves that they will eventually have. As we look at some of the recent research that has looked at the performance of calves that are born to heat-stressed dams, there's some interesting data that may help us as we look at where we need to expend some more money as it comes to heat stress abatement on our dairy farms. Some of these studies have shown that heifers born to heat-stressed dams actually produce less milk in their first lactation, about 2,000 pounds less than those animals born to dams that were not heat-stressed. As we look at these generations, one of the things that is also noted is that performance in the second lactation as well as even the third lactation is reduced compared to those calves that were born to dams that were not heat-stressed late in gestation. As we think about late gestation, what's actually going on in the calf, that is the period where many of the fetal organs are still developing and actually growing at fairly high rates of growth. So if the mom is heat stressed, then that means the cells of the calf are sensing that there's a harsh environment, and that changes the trajectory of growth. As we look at the performance of these animals from some of the research studies, it's shown that calves born to heat-stressed dams are often smaller. They absorb fewer immunoglobulins from the colostrum and grow slower before weaning. Heat stress also reduces the size of the placenta, altering its structure and limiting the nutrient delivery to that developing fetus. So heat stress on these dry cows, particularly as they head toward calving, does have a very negative effect on the calf that they're going to have, which has a future impact on the profitability of our dairies. Also, additional research is starting to show that calves that were born to heat-stressed dams, as they become productive animals, their calves or future generations are also impacted by this stress, and sometimes even into the second and third generation, we see negative impacts on animal performance due to the heat stress that original dam suffered during her time in utero as a result of the environment that the dam was exposed to. So as we consider what we might do to improve summertime milk production, we also need to consider what we need to do in order to increase the calf performance of animals born during the summer. Cooling the dry cow is very, very important, and probably our most effective tools to do that would actually be supplemental fans as well as soaker systems, so that we provide an effective way to cool those animals. If you're not doing this on your dairy farm currently, I would encourage you to consider adding that to your heat abatement procedures for your farm, so that we keep these late gestation cows as cool and comfortable as possible, so that we can minimize the effect that the environment might have on their unborn calf. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension.
Thanks, Mike. And this reminder to listen anytime or to catch up on past programs, go to agtoday.net, or using a podcast app on your mobile device, type in these search keywords, Agriculture, Today, Kansas, and you'll find this program. Then tap on the subscribe button. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.